Here's the thing. There was an age where real-time strategy games were the hottest shit out there, especially on PC. It was a genre which also highlighted history as backdrops, meaning they were not only fun, but were made so much more exciting if one happened to be something of a history nerd oneself. And one of the game series which would become perhaps the most legendary historical RTS games of all time was Age of Empires. Now, I personally never touched an Age of Empires game until I was in my 20s, meaning about 20 years after the game's original release. And therefore, as hopefully is evident, we are diving into the definitive editions here, which arguably exclusively improves on the original versions, which you'll see right here. As you can see, most of the improvements are visual and don't really change the gameplay itself at all, perhaps only controls or accessibility aspects, which, again, only a good thing. Age of Empires is an RTS, meaning that everything happens in real time rather than by turn, and what's more, it's impossible to pause the game to micromanage stuff, nor can we fast forward in Age of Empires, which means you really need to be on your toes here. If you've ever played any Age of Empires game, you probably already know the basics, and that really says one of two things. That this game got it right the first time, or that the Age of Empires decadence is real. Well, perhaps even both can be true at the same time. You see, Age of Empires is all about taking specific civilizations through the ages, often beginning and ending within a certain time period, although this varies depending on the games. In Age 1, the main theme is the Bronze Age and antiquity as a whole. In other words, the focus is on the early civilizations, like the Egyptians, Sumerians, Carthaginians, the Romans, and many more. It's a natural place to start, I feel, and somehow there's something about the older visual style that resonates even with the time period of the game, as it kinda feels like you're in the ancient world playing an ancient game. It's just a vibe, I guess, but that doesn't mean it looks bad. On the contrary, I absolutely love the way this version of Age 1 looks. It's simple but extremely charming, and the higher resolution, the more beauty comes out of it. From the detailed buildings, units, their animations, and the nature around, it's a game that's been updated so vastly that it could have been made today as a retro-style title. The basics of this game is, as mentioned, taking your civilization from the earliest of primitive beginnings to imperial ends. We begin in the Stone Age with the bare necessities, hunting and gathering, and we advance towards more refined eras with many more options. It's perhaps not as dynamic as it might sound though. Here we gather food, stone, gold, and wood, and a number of these are needed to move from one age to another, including building a certain amount of buildings from that age. This may be done by hunting animals, farming, fishing, and mining. I sometimes had issues knowing exactly which buildings belong to the latest era though, and especially if you're short on resources, it can be difficult to make that choice. It is possible to check out the technology window to find out exactly which buildings belong to which age though, but the UI is kind of awkward to navigate at times. It's also absolutely vital to realize that ages themselves won't unlock everything. In fact, certain buildings once built unlocks new ones, which are vital to make headway. This is, after all, not a chill city builder at all, but a very competitive game even versus the AI, and it took me a few games before I got the knack of things. Of course, there's also a campaign, and it's quite extensive, allowing us to play several of the main cultures in the game. Now, as you know, we have Greeks, Romans, and Egyptians here, among others, and they each have their own type of units. The Egyptians get a bonus to gold mining and farming and field elephant and chariot units. The Romans have decreased building costs and more efficient warriors, while the Babylonians have the most powerful walls and the best stone miners in the game. As you might be able to tell, all of these bonuses are meant to reflect their historical strengths. While these differences are nice, I have to say that the variations between factions are rather minimal. The playstyles are more or less the same except for the slight differences in proficiency and what you might focus on and when. So while it's fun to change up the factions, I mostly do it for the look and vibe of things, not really the gameplay all that much. I do enjoy the span of factions here though, as there really is an impressive amount of ancient cultures present. One of the major things with Age of Empires is exploring the map, and you only really begin with a tiny portion of it revealed. While it makes for exciting gameplay in theory where we rarely if ever know where things are, it ends up being a rather tedious game of ordering your people around until they find something. It only really becomes a viable gameplay mechanic once you unlock the scout cavalry, but that can take some time. Another important thing to notice is that despite being able to field quite a number of soldiers, they're never collected in regiments. Instead, each individual unit must be moved around and micromanaged. You can double-click to select all the units of a certain type, or move the cursor over several at a time to select more than one. But it's still a somewhat cumbersome affair, and even though it's cool in certain ways, in that each unit might have more impact, it would have been nice to have the option to permanently merge them. Last but not least, Age of Empires 1 offers some absolutely fantastic music. It's just so retro and ancient at the same time, and I love that it's giving me that old school RuneScape vibe, and I imagine it's due to the bitrate of the music. Sometimes it just takes off though, as it does in my favorite track, Medieval Melody, specifically the remastered version. 2 years after Age of Empires release in 1997, Age of Empires 2 saw the light of day in 1999, or to once more jump 20 years ahead, Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition launched in 2019. Now the difference in visuals between these two definitive editions, as with the original versions actually, are not that major. Although weirdly enough, I do prefer the visuals of the first game. Age of Empires just looks a bit more like a remaster than a full remake, and it still has some of that old DNA in its visuals which I, personally, don't find as charming as the first one. The fact that I can't zoom as far down, or that this weird thing shows up when I press the right mouse button to pan the camera, is just not for me. As a game though, AoE 2 does change up a few things, and virtually only for the better. Every civilization now begins with a scout, and it comes with an auto-explore feature, meaning the tedious chore of the past is gone if you want it to be. I think the horse in itself is a good addition though, and the auto feature is totally up to you to use after all. We also have the matter of capturing cows and sheep this time around, and the first faction to approach them are able to move them back to camp, where your hungry peasants will kill them and harvest their meat. The most important change in AoE 2 is arguably that of the time period, which has moved from mainly antiquity to focusing on the medieval period. Now we can choose factions like the Byzantines, France, the Saracens, Cumans, and just so many more. I like that they've kept with the diversity in factions, as most of the medieval world is represented here actually. Again though, the difference between factions are not necessarily that great. Each culture of course come with different strengths and weaknesses, and if you learn how to take advantage of them, there are of course ways to get ahead, and to really see those changes. But most of these differences between factions do remain as percentage changes of various and unique tech, buildings or units, and they don't necessarily make that much difference in terms of innate playstyles. There's no need to relearn the game to change between the factions for example, and even though that can be a good thing in terms of accessibility and competitive multiplayer, the incremental changes also mean that you really have to remember what your faction excels at. Instead of it being obvious as I played, I found myself having to either write down or focus on remembering what my factions could do that others could not. That was before I actually learned to click the faction icon in the top right though, where all of those factors are conveniently displayed, which is definitely helpful. If one wants to, Age of Empires 2 can be a very min-maxy game for this reason, as everything is essentially based on the time it takes to complete tasks, and the falling behind can mean the end of everything. This matters especially because Age of Empires 2 makes a faction's defenses more powerful, not only by adding more health to buildings, but also by making town centers into defensive buildings, and allows walls to have gates, meaning it's arguably both more fun and important to have walls here. What I do find nice is that we now have better unit formations. Units will still be individually moved by default, and it is kind of a hassle to move them into the heat of battle still for me personally, but we can choose between a few formations now, as long as we keep selecting them together. What I continue to enjoy about Age of Empires 2 is that the AI keeps being hard as knuckles. It seems in other games you can get by as long as you know your basics, but if you're not literally on your toes here, the AI will have at least 1 or 2 players that will not only lead you in points, but come out of nowhere and knock your socks off. I think even more than the first one, AoE 2 can be absolutely hardcore, and teaches us that not only must you build your own civilization, but also ruin those of others before they come to ruin yours. I love building those massive castles, and my favorite unit regardless of factions has to be the Trebuchet, whose sounds and sheer power just oozes a vibe so much more complex than their models give them credit for. Much of what I said about Age of Empires, the basics of resources and all that, also goes for Age of Empires 2. It continues to be an RTS, where food, wood, stone and gold continue to be the alpha omega of the game, And honestly, apart from the quality of life changes and improvements, I kinda feel like AoE 2 is more or less just a reskin of the first game. And I must admit that even though much is improved on in AoE 2, that I kinda preferred the first game. I think it's because of the whole vibe, maybe coupled with the ancient time period perhaps. Where AoE 2 absolutely excels at though, is in the campaign department. From a relatively simplistic setup in the first game, AoE 2 offers a beautiful campaign overview map with every campaign and where they're taking place. I love this aesthetic as it not only shows us where in the world our stories take place, but it's also just a great design. And just check out how many campaigns there are here. This will take you hours, days, and weeks or even months to complete. And even though some of them are locked behind expansions and DLCs, it really shows how vast this game is, especially in terms of its factions. The campaign presentations themselves have gotten a real lift as well, sporting a charming storytelling phase, in addition to some in-game cutscenes as well. What's fun about the Age of Empires games, and this remains true for AoE 2, is the active online community. I've rarely had issues finding matches even now all these years later, and I think it's owed to two things. First, that the community around these games is real, and that playing them involves a fast-paced and addictive gameplay loop, meaning people are likely to come back. Although by now, of course, it will be difficult for noobs to enter the scene. That doesn't mean it's not still fun though. And two, that the remake versions are relatively new and keep offering new expansion packs relatively often. Even more often than the latest game itself actually, which is kind of shocking honestly. And whereas the first game has no definitive edition expansions, Age of Empires 2 has 3, all of them bringing new civilizations, campaigns, and flavor to the game all these years later. Now, Age of Empires 3 is a major one in several ways. Originally released in 2005, which, damn, that is actually quite a long time ago, the definitive edition released in 2020. Now, instead of looking definitely retro, Age 3 is probably the best looking Age of Empires game of all time, depending on your choice of style. What hit me first is the sheer visual overhaul here, looking like a completely different generation than Age of Empires 1 and 2, while somehow also looking better than Age of Empires 4, which launched 16 years later. Yes, I know this is a remaster, but still it just shows you how ahead of time this game was, and perhaps how Age of Empires 4 failed to innovate, but we'll get back to that one later. Speaking of innovation, Age of Empires 3 really tried its absolute best, and even though it stumbled a few places, I have to say I truly admire it for going that extra mile. Because if the visuals weren't enough, Age of Empires 3 completely changes how Age of Empires plays. First of all, gone is the stone resource, an immediate thing I noticed. The second and arguably the biggest change in the history of Age of Empires concerns the collection of resources. I'm sure this put a ton of fans off and sent them into a massive rage, because they changed it for the next game again. But what we have here is a system where villagers do not need gathering points. Like at all. That means no lumber mills or mines. Instead, we just order the chopping down of trees and see the resources tick in. I have to admit it's a kind of jarring thing at first, but I did get used to it. And so, do I like the change? I have to say I don't know. I could take it or leave it kinda, but I will say that I do think I prefer a system of gathering points, as not having them makes everything seem a bit more arcadey for no reason. What I do love though is that we can see exactly how many resources we gather per minute, which is extremely handy and kinda tells you how you're doing, in addition to seeing how many people work on which resource. The building system is also different now, in that soldiers only really become a thing from the second age onward. What I fail to explain to myself here is whether I like the UI or not. And the reason I say that is because, even though it looks far more modern than the first two games, there's something about it that seems to strain my eyes. It's somehow too cluttered without even offering that much. I don't really know how else to explain it. Other than a collection of resources, we also have a whole system of cards and home cities. Again, something which is extremely innovative and exciting, but something which also destroys the gameplay loop of the earlier games. Essentially, every player has a home city which will show on your main menu, and you can even customize this by racking up points by playing the game. But this home system offers even more, as it has implications in-game through its card system. Now here's the thing, this card system is absolutely confusing. You essentially get to choose various cards, which gives you bonuses depending on their abilities. These further vary by age, so the further in a game you are, the more powerful the cards become. In the definitive edition, every card in the game is already unlocked, so at least new players won't be smashed by more powerful cards held by pros, although pros likely won't need the cards at all either way. In the original game, you actually had to unlock the cards though, which actually was a fun little minigame to collect and complete, but perhaps it's better this way. Either way, I think the system in practice is more cumbersome than it is fun. It's not that it's not fun, it just again might do more harm than good to the gameplay loop and the feeling of genuine progression. For me personally, I think it could have perhaps worked better if the system was tied to something in-game, like those trade posts and other stations placed around the map, which offer unique units and other bonuses. In this way, cards could become more integrated than essentially being magical spawn bonuses. And speaking of things on the map, we now also have special units which go around and hunt for treasure. Again, I don't know about this one exactly. Perhaps my biggest gripe with Age of Empires 3 though, is oddly enough the building system. It seems to me that, even though Age of Empires was never about building realistic cities, that Age 3 kind of makes it even less so. You see, I really enjoy building farms in my towns, but in Age 3, most civilizations only raise mills, and there are no actual farms to place down here. In this way, Age 3 feels a bit less grounded than the other games, especially when considering the removal of things like lumber mills and gathering points. This removal of space also makes for maps that feel smaller. Again, I really like Age of Empires 3. I think it was an extremely brave addition to the series. The fact that it misstepped here and there does not make that any less true, and making the wrong choices does not mean that innovation is wrong. Age of Empires 3 now has some of the best visuals in the genre, as it did back in 2005. It remains the most standout-ish Age game not only because of its time period, but because of everything it tried to do to take the series into the future. It still has an online presence luckily, and there are those that believe Age 3 indeed was the best game, at least the bravest, despite taking a few wrong turns here and there. And you know, I really respect that, and I'm partial to think that Age 3 is the best of the games, at least in certain aspects. Age of Empires 4 released in 2021, an entire 16 years after Age 3. The team definitely chose to play it safe this time in more ways than one, and again, for better or worse. Age of Empires 4 looks like it could have launched at any point in the past 10 years, and that's not a compliment really. To be sure, the game looks visually pleasing. It's soft with a relatively rich vibe, but its animated look feels too much like a safe play. And with so many years in between, and with AoE 3 being the visual powerhouse it was, I was hoping for so much more here. What I will say is that AoE 4 probably sports the best UI in the series. It's just really clean and minimalistic, and you always know where things are. And speaking of playing it safe, AoE 4 really feels like a spiritual remake of AoE 2. It's not all bad. The lumber mills and other gathering points are back, and we've also returned to the medieval period. The gameplay loop we know and love is back then, and AoE 4 really does have that addicting feeling to it. Rather than only bringing back things though, we've also lost a lot. Not just things like home cities and card systems, but also the potential for more. There is almost nothing new in Age of Empires 4. Very few innovative mechanics, gameplay styles, anything to make the game take a big step forward. Almost nothing, except for my personal favorite thing about the game, namely the fact that factions are now more different from each other than ever. I love that you have to have entirely different focuses as the Chinese and the French, for example, not just in terms of the units they favor, but also the bonuses they are awarded, which reward certain playstyles. I think one of my favorite ones has become the Chinese actually, as I love that their entire faction is built around massive populations and defense. Essentially, they have a unique building called the Village, which gives a population limit boost of 40 rather than the normal 10 awarded by a house. And as time goes on, you can even build a unique building to transition not just ages, but also Chinese dynasties, which awards you extra bonuses still. This is where AoE 4 shines in my opinion, and really is the only place where innovation has been made. But still, AoE 4 is fun to play. I lament the lack of changes and updates and truly new ways to play Age of Empires, but I still find it fun to go online and battle it out against other players. And I think that's honestly the aim of this remake. Make it more casual, but still try to create a system where players can become pros and hardcore. Finding a game is easy, and because of this simple gameplay system, AoE 4 just feels fun to jump in and play. Again, it's definitely more of a casual game, even though it's damn hard to fight against the pros, for better or worse. I think one of my biggest disappointments come from the campaign. I feel like the more real-life footage approach takes me out of the immersion, and I wish more effort had gone into making the campaign something totally different. Whereas the battles can stay largely the same, I'd love a campaign map approach by now. And when you know that Relic is giving that exact treatment to another one of his games, namely Company of Heroes 3, I wish they could have done that for Age of Empires 4 as well. But again, the lack of innovation and mantra of playing it safe really embodies this entire game, and after so many years, I wish they would have tried just a bit more. I actually think a great analogy for this is Civilization 6, where that game followed almost exactly the same trajectory as AoE 4. It had little true innovation, and the visual style was made less realistic and more animation-like, giving both these games more of a childlike, mobile-like vibe. It also frustrates me to know that, despite this being their new flagship game, AoE 4 has yet to get one single expansion, as the first one arrives in late October, a whole year after. This pack, which includes the Ottomans and the Malians, will be free however, which I guess is a really nice gesture. But I doubt they will do much to innovate, so it's more of a flavor pack than anything else. I'm certain we can expect many such updates from AoE 4 in the future, but my hopes for an Age of Empires that really brings something new to the genre are dead for now, and I think the age of Age of Empires being a trendsetter is over. And that was the entire Age of Empires series, at least the main games. Of course, I focused on the definitive versions of the game, and I only really began playing the series years or decades after the originals came out, so my views are colored by this fact. All in all, I think the concept of Age of Empires is really fun. The feeling from building something from scratch is excellent, and going through the ages is a fantastic concept that makes you feel and see the evolution of your civilization. And that might have been enough 2 decades ago. But now, I can't help but feel that it's not anymore. I want Age of Empires to be more. I want it to have a campaign that merges with the battles. And no, it doesn't have to be Total War or Paradox, but I want more complexity here. And I feel like my battles are more important and can lead to something more than just beginning from scratch in another. Giving context and meaning to battles is to me what gives battles in Total War their meaning, for example. And I think it could give Age of Empires a real jolt up the butt in terms of innovation, and to truly make this series be at the forefront of the strategy genre once more. Thank you so much for watching. Going through this series has been really fun, although it definitely feels like you're playing the same game most of the time. It's kind of interesting how that goes for many strategy game series, I suppose. Now I want to know what you think of this series, and if you agree or absolutely disagree with me. Let me know down below, and if you enjoyed this video, it would mean a lot if you'd leave a comment and sub to the channel, and even support me as a YouTube member or as a patron. Thanks again guys, and I'll see you next time. Cheers!